Sabalenka couldn't hold back tears. The world watched her crack. This was the moment everything changed for her. A champion built on power, intensity, and fearlessness, suddenly standing still, overwhelmed. The trophies, the rankings, the dominance, none of it mattered in that moment. Because for the first time, Sabalenka wasn't fighting an opponent across the net, she was fighting herself. And what those tears revealed would spark debate, backlash, and a new chapter in her legacy.
Even though I didn't get it this year, I'll come back stronger and I'll do my best next year.
Before the tears, before the silence, before that moment froze the tennis world, Aryna Sabalenka was everything people thought a modern champion should be. Loud in her power, ruthless in her intent, unapologetic in her ambition. She wasn't just winning matches, she was imposing herself on the tour. By the time the 2025 season reached its most critical stretch, Sabalenka sat at the top of women's tennis. World number one, Grand Slam champion, a player opponents feared long before the coin toss. Her game was built on force, booming serves, flat winners, and a mentality that screamed dominance. When Sabalenka stepped onto the court, it didn't feel like a contest, it felt like a warning. And yet, that version of Sabalenka, the one fans thought they understood, was only part of the story. Because dominance comes with expectation, and expectation, when it piles up, doesn't just sharpen focus, it suffocates. Every tournament she entered came with the same unspoken demand: win or explain why you didn't. Anything less than a title was treated as failure. Analysts praised her power but questioned her control. Commentators admired her aggression, but wondered if it would one day betray her. Even in victory, the conversation never stopped circling what might go wrong next. Sabalenka felt it. She always had. In interviews, she spoke openly about pressure, not as a buzzword, but as a constant presence. The weight of defending points, the burden of staying number one, the knowledge that every opponent played their best tennis against her, because beating Aryna Sabalenka meant something. It meant headlines. It meant credibility. And still, she kept winning. She collected titles across hard courts. She battled through long matches where her emotions boiled over, fist pumps turning into frustrated glares, roars of triumph followed by moments of visible tension. Fans loved her fire, but they also watched closely, sensing something fragile beneath the surface. This wasn't a champion who played on autopilot. This was a champion who felt everything. Behind the scenes, Sabalenka's season was relentless. Travel, media obligations, expectations from sponsors, the unending spotlight that follows the world number one. There was no quiet space to fail privately. Every slip, every double fault, every grimace was dissected in real time. And yet, the results kept justifying the pressure. She entered the biggest tournaments not as a hopeful contender, but as the standard everyone measured themselves against. Rivals spoke about her power with respect, sometimes even fear. Younger players studied her matches frame by frame, trying to understand how to survive her onslaught. But survival was becoming Sabalenka's own internal battle. Because for all her success, something was tightening. Matches she once closed comfortably began stretching longer. Moments that should have been routine became tense. She won, but not without cost, and that cost was emotional energy she could never fully recover between tournaments. Still, no one expected what would come next. Not the fans who cheered her name, not the critics who doubted her composure, not even Sabalenka herself. From the outside, she looked unbreakable, a champion in her prime, perfectly positioned to dominate an era. But pressure doesn't announce when it reaches its limit. It waits. It builds. It disguises itself as motivation until suddenly it demands payment. And when that payment came, it wouldn't arrive quietly. It would arrive in front of millions, in a moment no trophy could soften, in a moment when Aryna Sabalenka would stop being just a champion and become human in a way the world couldn't ignore. And if this was the peak of her power, why did it feel like the beginning of her hardest fight? The French Open final was supposed to be Aryna Sabalenka's moment of confirmation. Clay had never been her most forgiving surface, but this run felt different. Match after match, she pushed through long rallies, heavy conditions, and relentless pressure. She didn't just survive Paris, she earned her place in the final. Across the net stood Coco Gauff, younger, faster, hungrier, and fully aware that this was not just a final, it was a referendum on the future of women's tennis. From the opening games, Sabalenka looked locked in. Her power punched through the heavy air, her body language aggressive, her intentions clear. This was her match to take. And for stretches, it looked exactly that way. But finals don't reward intention, they punish hesitation. As the match wore on, the rallies lengthened. Gauff absorbed pace, redirected shots, and forced Sabalenka to hit one more ball than she wanted to. The margins tightened. A forehand clipped the tape, a serve missed by inches, one double fault turned into two, and suddenly the pressure that had been simmering all season boiled over. Sabalenka's frustration became visible. She paced between points, she shook her head, she looked to her box for answers that never came. Every missed opportunity echoed louder than the last. The crowd sensed it, that subtle shift where belief starts leaning toward the other side. Then the match turned. Gauff took control, not by overpowering Sabalenka, but by outlasting her emotionally. Each point became a test of patience, and patience was the one thing slipping from Sabalenka's grip. When the final games unfolded, there was no dramatic collapse, just the slow, painful realization that the title was gone. And when the last point ended, the camera stayed. That's when the moment happened. Standing during the ceremony, Aryna Sabalenka tried to compose herself. She inhaled, she exhaled, but her voice cracked anyway. Tears filled her eyes as she addressed the crowd, admitting, "This one hurts so much after such a tough 2 weeks, showing such terrible tennis in the final. It really hurts." It wasn't scripted, it wasn't polished, it wasn't the soundbite fans were used to hearing from champions. It was raw. For some, it was heartbreaking. For others, uncomfortable. Because champions aren't supposed to say those things out loud. They're supposed to congratulate their opponent, smile, and promise to come back stronger. Sabalenka did congratulate Gauff, sincerely, but her honesty overshadowed everything else. Social media exploded within minutes. Supporters praised her vulnerability. Critics questioned her sportsmanship. Was she diminishing Gauff's victory, or was she simply admitting the truth of her own disappointment? The debate grew louder than the applause. And right there, in that emotional pause between defeat and acceptance, Aryna Sabalenka crossed an invisible line, from dominant champion to lightning rod. Because once the tears were seen, they couldn't be unseen. And the question everyone started asking wasn't about tactics or match stats anymore. It was simpler, more dangerous. Had the pressure finally caught up with Aryna Sabalenka, or had she just shown the world who she really was? And if this was only one final, why did it feel like the beginning of something much bigger? The match was over, but the real storm was just beginning. Within minutes of Aryna Sabalenka leaving the court, her words were everywhere. Clips of her emotional speech spread across social media faster than the final score itself. Headlines didn't focus on Coco Gauff's victory. They focused on Sabalenka's tears, her honesty, and the sentence that split the tennis world in two. Some fans saw courage. They pointed out what others ignored, that Sabalenka never disrespected her opponent, never denied Gauff's brilliance. She simply spoke about her own pain. Supporters flooded timelines with messages of empathy, reminding everyone that elite athletes aren't machines, that losing a Grand Slam final after 2 brutal weeks would break anyone. But not everyone was sympathetic. Critics were louder, sharper, and unforgiving. Commentators questioned whether a world number 1 should publicly describe her performance as terrible in a championship match. Former players debated whether such words unintentionally took attention away from the winner. Pundits dissected her tone, her pauses, even the moment her voice cracked, as if emotion itself had rules. The internet did what it always does. It picked sides. One camp framed Sabalenka as emotionally authentic, a rare glimpse into the cost of greatness. The other framed her as emotionally unstable, proof that pressure still controlled her when it mattered most. Memes appeared, clips were replayed out of context. A few seconds of vulnerability became a full-blown narrative. And that narrative followed her. Every subsequent interview came with the same undertone. Journalists didn't ask about tactics, they asked about composure. They asked whether she regretted her words. They asked if she felt she'd crossed a line. Sabalenka didn't back down. She acknowledged the pain, admitted the disappointment, but refused to apologize for feeling what she felt. That stance only intensified the conversation. In a sport obsessed with control, she had openly lost it and refused to pretend otherwise. Meanwhile, Coco Gauff found herself pulled into a controversy she never asked for. Fans speculated about private apologies. Others claimed tension that neither player publicly confirmed. Silence was interpreted as meaning. Respect was mistaken for resentment. The rivalry narrative wrote itself. Every future meeting between the two was suddenly framed as emotional, unfinished business. Not because of trash talk, not because of bad blood, but because of one moment where the winner smiled and the loser cried. And beneath it all was a deeper question no one could escape. Why was Sabalenka's reaction judged so harshly? Male athletes had cried on podiums, they had slammed equipment, cursed themselves, admitted heartbreak. Often they were praised for passion, for caring, for wanting it too much. Sabalenka was criticized for the same thing. That double standard didn't go unnoticed. Fans and analysts alike began reframing the debate, not just as a question of sportsmanship, but as a reflection of how women in sport are allowed to express emotion. By the time the headlines slowed, one thing was clear. Aryna Sabalenka hadn't just lost a final. She had triggered a conversation tennis wasn't ready for. And once that door was opened, it wasn't going to close quietly. Because the next time she stepped onto the court, the crowd wouldn't just be watching her forehand, they'd be watching her face. If the French Open tears were the spark, the weeks that followed became the fire. Every match Aryna Sabalenka played after Paris carried an added layer of scrutiny. Cameras lingered longer between points. Commentators lowered their voices whenever she missed an easy ball. Fans weren't just watching her tennis anymore, they were waiting for a reaction. And then came the WTA Finals. This was supposed to be her reset, a controlled environment, the best of the best, a chance to remind everyone why she was still the standard. But instead, it became another emotional checkpoint she couldn't escape. Against Jelena Rybakina, Sabalenka never found her rhythm. The power was there, but the timing wasn't. Points slipped away quickly. Frustration returned even faster. When the match ended in straight sets, Sabalenka sat on her chair longer than usual, staring at the court as if trying to understand how it had happened again. The cameras didn't cut. Tears welled up. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet, exhausted emotion. She applauded her opponent, she acknowledged the crowd, but the image was already everywhere. The world number one, overwhelmed again on the biggest stage. The reaction was immediate. Critics called it a pattern, supporters called it proof of how much she cared. Headlines questioned whether Sabalenka was burning out under pressure, whether the emotional honesty that once drew admiration was now becoming a liability. Even praise felt heavy. People spoke about her mental battles more than her game, about her emotions more than her achievements. The narrative was shifting, and Sabalenka knew it. In later comments, she admitted she needed time to step back, to process, to understand what she was feeling instead of fighting it. This wasn't collapse, it was confrontation. Because for the first time in her career, Aryna Sabalenka wasn't just battling opponents, she was battling expectations, her own most of all. And the hardest part? There was no opponent across the net she could hit through to make it stop. By the time the noise began to fade, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Aryna Sabalenka wasn't running from her emotions anymore. She was finally sitting with them. Away from the spotlight, she spoke more quietly, more thoughtfully. There was no dramatic statement, no attempt to rewrite what had happened. Instead, she admitted something champions rarely do, that winning hadn't protected her from feeling overwhelmed, and losing had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd long ignored. She didn't frame the tears as weakness, she framed them as honesty. Sabalenka explained that the pressure of staying on top felt heavier than chasing the top ever did. Every tournament came with expectations that didn't reset, they accumulated. Every opponent wanted to make a statement against her. Every mistake felt amplified. And when you're expected to be strong all the time, eventually the body listens and the emotions follow. This wasn't about one final. It wasn't about one loss. It was about carrying the role of the dominant one without ever being allowed to falter. For years, Sabalenka had been told to control her emotions, to channel them, to suppress them, and she did, until she couldn't. The tears weren't planned, they weren't strategic. They were the result of someone who cared deeply, who invested everything, and who finally reached a moment where pretending felt heavier than being real. That's where opinions began to shift. Fans who initially criticized her reaction started to reconsider. Former players spoke about how close they themselves had been to breaking on similar stages. Mental health conversations entered the discussion, not as excuses, but as realities of elite sport. Sabalenka didn't claim victimhood. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply acknowledged the cost. And that acknowledgement changed how people saw her, not just as a hitter, not just as a champion, but as someone navigating pressure in public without a script. The irony was impossible to miss. The very emotion that sparked backlash also deepened connection. People who had never rooted for her before began to understand her. They didn't just see results anymore, they saw process, struggle, and resilience. Because strength isn't only measured by how hard you hit the ball. Sometimes it's measured by your willingness to stand still, let the moment hurt, and not look away. And the biggest question now wasn't whether Aryna Sabalenka could win again. It was whether this emotional reckoning might actually make her stronger than ever before. Because what if those tears weren't the breaking point? What if they were the turning point? Aryna Sabalenka's tears didn't just linger on social media for a few hours. They lingered in the minds of fans, players, and commentators long after the matches ended. That single moment at the French Open and the quiet heartbreak at the WTA Finals became a defining point in her career, reshaping the way the world saw her. For some, she was simply a champion with a flaw. For others, she was a trailblazer in emotional authenticity. By now, Sabalenka had achieved almost everything the sport could offer: Grand Slam titles, the world #1 ranking, a reputation as one of the most formidable players on tour. Yet her legacy was no longer measured only by wins or trophies. It was measured by courage, the courage to let the world see vulnerability, to break the mold of what it means to be a champion in women's tennis. Her post-match honesty sparked conversations beyond tennis. Commentators began questioning why women in sport were judged differently for showing emotion, while men often received praise for the same reactions. Fans debated whether emotional transparency was a strength or a weakness, and young players looked at her as proof that even the strongest could feel deeply. Sabalenka's moment forced an entire generation to reconsider the boundaries of toughness. And yet, despite scrutiny, she emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. She worked on her game, yes, but she also embraced the emotional side of her sport, the joy, the disappointment, the raw humanity that had been hidden beneath the dominance. Every match following those tearful moments was no longer just a contest of skill. It was a testament to resilience, self-awareness, and authenticity. In the end, the legacy of that tearful champion is not defined by a single loss or a fleeting moment of heartbreak. It's defined by the courage to remain human in a world that demands perfection. Sabalenka showed that emotion is not a liability. It can be a statement, a spark, and even a source of connection. And as fans reflect on that defining moment, one question lingers. Was Aryna Sabalenka's tears a sign of weakness, or the most powerful act of honesty we've ever seen in women's tennis? Her story reminds us that even champions are allowed to break, to feel, and to rise again. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them unforgettable. Short conclusion and subscribe, CTA. Aryna Sabalenka's journey proves that emotion and excellence can coexist. Her tears weren't the end, they were a beginning. If you want to see more stories of passion, rivalry, and unforgettable moments in women's tennis, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss the drama that defines the sport.